The warm scent of freshly baked bread filled the air as I slid another tray of golden brown loaves onto the cooling rack. The bakery was quiet now, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. This was my sanctuary. Every loaf, every pastry, every carefully crafted treat felt like a piece of me, a labor of love that kept our small town coming back day after day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it was mine. I glanced at the clock. 4:30 p.m. Grace would be home soon. My wife of 7 years, Grace Devereux, now Grace Harris, had grown up in a world that couldn't be further from the one we built together. Her family was old money, the kind that came with sprawling estates, black tie galas, and a last name that opened doors. Grace always said she loved the simplicity of our life, that she chose me because I wasn't like the men she grew up around, calculating, ambitious, and empty. But lately, I'd begun to wonder if she still meant it. When we first met, Grace was the light in my world. She strolled into my bakery one rainy afternoon, shaking the water from her umbrella and flashing a smile so warm it could melt butter. She ordered a slice of cherry pie, stayed for hours, and by the time the rain stopped, I knew she was special. It didn't matter that her parents barely tolerated me. Grace chose this life, or so I thought. As I wiped down the counters, I heard the familiar crunch of gravel in the driveway. Grace was home. I smiled reflexively, though there was a tightness in my chest that hadn't been there before. She walked in, immaculate as always, her tailored coat and designer heels a stark contrast to the flour-dusted apron I wore. Her smile was perfunctory, her greeting brief. She dropped her purse on the counter, one of those purses that cost more than my monthly rent before we got married, and began scrolling through her phone. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to inject some cheer into the moment. "Busy," she replied without looking up. "The foundation meeting ran late. Mom's planning a dinner with the Winchesters next week. You should come." Her tone was more obligatory than inviting. I nodded, masking my unease. The Devereux family was always planning something: dinners, charity galas, brunches with important people. I tried to fit into their world, but it always felt like I was wearing someone else's shoes. Too tight, too polished, not mine. "Sounds good," I said, though we both knew I wouldn't enjoy it. Grace looked up finally, her gaze flickering to the bakery's ledger I'd left open on the counter. "How's the bakery doing?" she asked, her voice neutral but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Good," I replied, keeping it short. The bakery was doing fine, not thriving, but not failing either. It paid the bills and gave us a comfortable life, though I suspected Grace wished for more. Her family's money wasn't something we leaned on, and I was proud of that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace measured my success by her father's standards, and I would always fall short. "You know," she began, her voice careful, "Dad was talking about diversifying investments. Maybe you should consider expanding. Opening another location." I set down the towel I'd been holding and met her gaze. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm happy with where we are." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded absently, already returning her attention to her phone. The conversation felt like a warning bell, subtle but insistent. Something was shifting between us, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it. Later that evening, as we sat down to dinner, Grace seemed distracted. She pushed her food around her plate, her phone lighting up every few minutes with texts I pretended not to notice. I wanted to ask what was on her mind, but the words caught in my throat. Part of me didn't want to know the answer. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about the bakery, about Grace, about the life we'd built together. It was a good life, wasn't it? Simple, yes, but good. But as I listened to the soft hum of her breathing beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that for Grace, it might not be enough anymore. And for the first time, I wondered if it ever had been. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen as I opened the bakery early the next morning. It was my ritual to get there before the sun rose, a quiet time when it was just me, the dough, and the hum of the ovens. It gave me a sense of peace, a way to focus on the day ahead without the noise of the world creeping in. But that peace had been harder to hold on to lately. Grace's words from last night echoed in my mind. "Maybe you should consider expanding." It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, but it felt heavier now. Less like a suggestion and more like a subtle criticism, a hint that she didn't think my work was enough anymore. As I kneaded the dough, I thought back to when we first got married. Grace had always spoken with pride about my bakery. She loved telling people how her husband made the best croissants in town, or how I got up before dawn to make fresh bread every morning. She used to sit at the counter, sipping coffee and chatting with customers, her laugh filling the space like music. But lately, she wasn't around as much. She was spending more time with her family, attending their events and dinners. I didn't begrudge her that. It was her family, after all, but it felt like she was pulling away from me and the life we'd built together. The first Real crack appeared a few weeks ago when Grace's mother, Victoria, visited the bakery unannounced. It wasn't unusual for her to drop by, but her visits were always brief and pointed. This time, she walked in, her sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor, her designer handbag perched on her arm like a trophy. "Alexander," she greeted, her tone clipped. "How are things at your little bakery?" Little. The word stung more than it should have, but I kept my expression neutral. "Things are going well, thank you." She glanced around, her critical eye taking in every detail. "Have you thought about diversifying? Expanding your product line, perhaps? It might help attract a more refined clientele." I forced a polite smile. "I'm happy with the way things are. Our regulars seem to enjoy what we offer." "Regulars," she repeated, as though the word left a bad taste in her mouth. "Well, Grace was mentioning that you've been hesitant to grow the business. It's a shame, really. With the right guidance, you could do so much more." I clenched my jaw but said nothing. Victoria had a way of making her criticisms sound like advice, but I knew what she meant. I wasn't ambitious enough, not for her daughter, not for their family. When Grace came home that evening, I brought up her mother's visit. "Victoria stopped by the bakery today," I said casually as we sat down to dinner. Grace didn't look up from her phone. "Oh? What did she want?" "She suggested I should think about expanding," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Grace sighed, setting her phone down. "She's just trying to help, Alex. You know how she is." "I do," I said, my voice steady. "But I don't think it's her place to tell me how to run my business." Grace's brow furrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might agree with me. But then she said, "She has a point, though. You've been doing the same thing for years. Maybe it's time to think bigger." I stared at her, the words catching in my throat. "Is that what you think? That I'm not doing enough?" Grace hesitated, her gaze flickering away. "I just think you have potential, Alex. You could do more if you wanted to." The conversation hung in the air long after it ended, an invisible weight pressing down on me. Grace's words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind as I went about my days. The bakery was my dream, my passion. I had poured my heart into it, building it from the ground up. But now, for the first time, I started to wonder if it was enough. Not for me, but for her. Was she ashamed of me? Embarrassed by my modest success? The thought was like a splinter, small but painful, burrowing deeper with every passing day. The signs of trouble were everywhere, now that I knew to look for them. Grace's growing distance, her mother's thinly veiled criticisms, the way her voice changed when she talked about her family's events compared to our quiet life. It was like watching a thread unravel, one small tug at a time. I didn't know where this was headed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. Thanksgiving was always a complicated affair in our household. Grace insisted we spend it with her family every year, and every year. I prepared myself for the gauntlet of thinly veiled insults and judgmental glances. This year, though, something felt different. Grace was unusually insistent that we attend, even though I'd suggested hosting it at our place for a change. "It's tradition," she said, brushing off my concerns with a wave of her hand. The day began like any other Thanksgiving. I woke early to prepare a batch of fresh pastries to bring to the Devereux estate. Grace barely acknowledged my effort, too busy perfecting her appearance to notice the tray of warm croissants and danishes I'd spent hours crafting. By the time we arrived at her parents' sprawling mansion, I was already on edge. Victoria greeted us at the door, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alexander," she said, her tone clipped, "how thoughtful of you to bring pastries." "They're fresh from the bakery," I replied, keeping my voice polite. "I thought they might make a nice addition to the dessert table." Her smile tightened. "How quaint." Grace didn't say anything, her attention already captured by her sister Amanda, who was showing off her latest designer outfit. I followed behind them into the grand dining room, feeling like an outsider in a world I didn't belong to. Dinner was a spectacle, as it always was in the Devereux household. A long table was adorned with silver platters and crystal glasses, the centerpiece a towering floral arrangement that looked more expensive than my monthly mortgage. The family was in their element, trading stories of business deals and exclusive events. I sat quietly, only speaking when spoken to, which wasn't often. As the meal progressed, Victoria turned her attention to me. "So, Alexander," she began, her voice carrying over the clinking of silverware. "What's new at the bakery? Have you considered my suggestion about expanding?" I forced a smile, setting down my fork. "I appreciate your input, Victoria, but I'm happy with the direction the bakery is going." Her eyebrows arched. "Happy? Alexander, happiness doesn't pay the bills. You should be thinking about the future, about growth. Grace deserves to be with someone who has ambition." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. I felt the heat rise in my face, but before I could respond, Grace spoke up. "Mother, please," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Alex works hard." Victoria didn't back down. "Working hard isn't enough. Success requires vision. Tell me, Alexander, do you even have a 5-year plan for your business?" The room went silent, all eyes on me. I felt like I was being put on trial, my worth measured by how well I could defend myself against Victoria's barbs. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I've built my bakery from the ground up," I said, my voice steady. "It may not be as glamorous as the businesses you're used to, but it's mine. It's brought joy to countless people in our community, and that's something I'm proud of." Victoria's lips curled into a patronizing smile. "How noble." I clenched my fists under the table, my patience wearing thin. Grace remained silent, her gaze fixed on her plate. I wanted her to speak up, to defend me, but she didn't. Instead, she let her mother's words hang in the air, unchallenged. The evening only got worse from there. After dinner, as the family moved to the sitting room for drinks, I overheard Victoria speaking to a group of guests. "It's such a shame," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "Grace could have married anyone, and she chose a man who bakes bread for a living." I turned away before I could hear more, the words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. By the time we left, my head was pounding, and my heart felt heavy. Grace was unusually quiet on the drive home, her gaze fixed out the window. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't defended me, why she let her family treat me like I was beneath them, but the words wouldn't come. When we got home, I set the tray of uneaten pastries on the counter and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Grace went straight to bed without a word, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Thanksgiving had always been difficult, but this year felt different. It wasn't just the usual jabs and condescension. It was the realization that Grace was no longer on my side. She had let her family's disdain for me seep into our marriage, and for the first time, I wondered if there was any way to fix it. As I sat in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the day settled on my shoulders. Something had to change. I didn't know what, but I couldn't keep living like this. Not anymore. The day after Thanksgiving, I woke up feeling hollow. The weight of the night before clung to me like a second skin. Grace had barely spoken to me since we returned home, and I had spent most of the night replaying Victoria's scathing words in my head. It wasn't just her insults. It was the way Grace didn't even flinch, didn't step in to defend me. She let me stand alone in the storm, as though I deserved it. But something shifted inside me that morning. I'd always been the quiet one, the one who let things slide for the sake of peace. Not anymore. If they wanted to see me as small, I would show them just how wrong they were. I had a plan, a reveal I'd been saving for the right moment, and this, I realized, was that moment. The following weekend, I made arrangements for brunch at Bellacina, my flagship restaurant. I hadn't told Grace much about Bellicina when we first met. It had always been a personal project, separate from the bakery. It was my labor of love, built on the recipes my grandmother taught me, and the dream of creating something that would leave a legacy. It had grown quietly, organically, until it was one of the most sought-after dining experiences in the city. And no one in Grace's family had the faintest idea that it was mine. When I suggested brunch at Bellicina, Grace barely looked up from her phone. "Sure, whatever," she said. "I could use something nice after last week." Nice. That's what she thought Bellicina was. A nice restaurant she'd never bothered to ask about. That suited me just fine. Sunday morning arrived, and Grace, dressed to impress, walked into Bellicina like she owned the place. Victoria, Richard, and Amanda followed, their expressions a mix of mild interest and judgment as they took in the sleek interior. Victoria sniffed. "It's quaint," she said, as though that was the worst insult she could muster. I smiled politely, biting back the words I wanted to say. "I thought you'd like it." We were shown to a prime table near the center of the restaurant, where sunlight streamed in through tall windows, casting a golden glow on the pristine white tablecloths. The air was filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. The staff moved with practiced grace, carrying plates of artfully presented dishes that smelled as good as they looked. Grace seemed impressed despite herself. "This place is nice," she admitted, glancing around. Victoria, however, was less subtle. "I assume you're friends with the owner?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "It's not your usual bakery fare." Her words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "Something like that," I said, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. As the meal progressed, I could see Victoria beginning to relax, no doubt enjoying the idea of dining at a restaurant she deemed worthy of her status. She was halfway through her second glass of wine when I decided it was time. I excused myself from the table and made my way to the manager, Michael, who greeted me with a respectful nod. "Is everything ready?" I asked. He smiled. "Yes, sir. Just say the word." I returned to the table, my heart pounding in my chest. As I took my seat, I caught Grace glancing at her phone, scrolling through social media as though the world around her barely mattered. Typical. I cleared my throat. "I hope everyone's enjoying the meal," I said, my voice steady, "because there's something I'd like to share." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What could that be?" I looked directly at her, letting the weight of my words settle before I spoke. "This restaurant? Bellicina? It's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace's head snapped up, her phone forgotten. Victoria's expression froze, the wineglass in her hand suspended mid-air. Amanda, who had been picking at her salad, stared at me like I'd just grown a second head. "I built this place from the ground up," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Every detail, every dish, every decision. It's all mine. And you've been sitting here, enjoying it, without even realizing." Victoria recovered first, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "You're joking." I shook my head. "Not at all. Bellicina is my passion project. It's what I've poured my heart and soul into for years, while you've all been busy judging me for being just a baker." Grace's face was a mixture of shock and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because you never asked," I said simply. "You never cared enough to see past your own assumptions." The rest of the meal was a blur. Victoria tried to save face, offering half-hearted compliments about the restaurant's ambience and food. Grace remained quiet, her face pale and her hands clenched in her lap. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in control, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had finally shown them the truth. As we left Bellicina that afternoon, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. They could no longer belittle me or dismiss my work. They had seen what I was capable of, and whether they liked it or not, they had to acknowledge it. I had nothing to prove to them anymore. The ride back home was silent. Grace sat stiffly beside me, her arms crossed, staring out the window. Victoria, in the back seat, muttered occasional comments, each one carefully loaded with veiled condescension. "Well, it's certainly impressive, Alexander," she finally said. But you must understand why we didn't expect it. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm not sure I do, Victoria, I replied evenly. What exactly didn't you expect? That I'd be capable of creating something successful? Or that I'd keep it from you because you never thought to ask? She didn't answer. Instead, she exchanged a glance with Grace, whose lips were pressed into a thin line. I wasn't looking for validation from them anymore, but the sting of their low expectations still lingered. That evening, after Victoria and the others left, Grace confronted me in the kitchen. She stood there, arms folded, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Why didn't you tell me, Alex?" she demanded. "Why keep it a secret?" I set the mug of coffee I'd been holding on the counter, meeting her gaze. "Because it was never a secret," I said calmly. "You just never showed any interest. Every time I mentioned my work, you dismissed it like it didn't matter. So I stopped sharing." Her expression faltered. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I countered, my voice steady but firm. "Grace, do you know how many late nights I've spent at Bellasina? How many sacrifices I've made to get it to where it is today? And in all those years, you never once asked about it. You were too busy listening to your mother tell you how I wasn't good enough." Grace flinched at my words, but she didn't deny them. Instead, she sighed and dropped her gaze to the floor. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't realize it meant that much to you." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "That's the problem, Grace. You didn't realize because you didn't care enough to notice." The days that followed were tense. Grace was quieter than usual, her usual sharp comments replaced with an awkward politeness that felt more like avoidance than genuine change. Victoria, on the other hand, seemed determined to maintain her dominance, making a point to call Grace every evening to discuss the opportunity Bellasina presented. "She's already talking about introducing you to some investors," Grace mentioned one night over dinner. Her tone was hesitant, like she was testing the waters. "She thinks you could expand globally with the right support." I set my fork down and met her gaze. "I'm not interested." Grace blinked. "Why not? It's a great opportunity." "For who?" I asked pointedly. "For me, or for your family to take credit for something they had no hand in building?" She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she looked away, her cheeks flushed with frustration. "You're being unreasonable," she muttered. "No, Grace," I said quietly but firmly. "I'm setting boundaries. Something I should have done a long time ago." One afternoon, as I was going over expansion plans with my team at Bellasina, James, Grace's brother, walked in. Unlike the rest of his family, James had always been a quiet observer, someone who stayed out of the fray but never fully engaged either. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as I discussed logistics with my operations manager. "Impressive," he said once the meeting ended. "I never would have guessed you had all this under wraps." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for the inevitable jab, but it never came. Instead, James stepped further into the room, his hands in his pockets. "Victoria's been trying to spin this into some kind of partnership opportunity," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "You should have seen her face when she realized she couldn't control this." I chuckled dryly. "I can imagine." James hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you've handled this well. Better than I would have." I nodded, appreciating the rare moment of sincerity. "Thanks, James." By the end of the week, it became clear that Victoria's interest in Bellasina wasn't going to fade quietly. She called multiple times, each conversation more persistent than the last. "Alexander, you have a responsibility to think about the potential here," she insisted during one call. "This isn't just about you anymore." "That's where you're wrong," I replied, cutting her off. "This has always been about me, my vision, my work, and my choices. I'm not handing it over to become a Devereux project." Her sharp intake of breath was satisfying. "You're being foolish," she snapped. "Do you know how many people would kill for the connections we can offer?" "Then they can have them," I said calmly. "I don't need your connections, Victoria. I've built this on my own, and I intend to keep it that way." Grace was quiet that night, her expression unreadable as she sat across from me at the dinner table. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Are you ever going to forgive me for not seeing it sooner?" I sighed. leaning back in my chair. I don't know, Grace. Forgiveness isn't the issue. It's about trust, and right now, I don't know if we can rebuild that. Her shoulders slumped, but she nodded. I understand. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were finally being honest with each other. Whether it was too late to salvage our marriage, I didn't know. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to compromise myself anymore, not for her or anyone else. The morning after the tense conversations with Grace and Victoria, I arrived at Bellacina early to prep for a staff meeting. The previous week had been a whirlwind of revelations, but I was determined to focus on the business and keep moving forward. My mind, however, was pulled back to Grace's hesitant apology the night before. Could she genuinely see the damage she and her family had caused, or was she merely trying to pacify me? As I settled into my office, reviewing our expansion plans, my assistant, Sarah, knocked on the door. Alexander, the Devereux family is here, she said cautiously, her eyes betraying her concern. I felt my chest tighten slightly but nodded. Let them in, I replied, steeling myself. This was bound to happen sooner or later. Victoria was the first to walk in, her presence as commanding as ever. Richard followed close behind, with James trailing at a safe distance, his usual quiet demeanor intact. Grace wasn't with them, and I wasn't sure if I felt relieved or disappointed. Victoria wasted no time. Alexander, she began, her voice measured but firm, we need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, gesturing for them to sit. Go ahead, I said, my tone neutral. Victoria placed a leather-bound portfolio on my desk. We've been discussing Bellacina's future and believe there's an incredible opportunity here for international growth. With the right partnerships, you could scale this to a level you've never imagined. I stared at her for a moment before opening the portfolio. Inside were detailed plans, projections, and potential investor profiles. It was thorough, I'd give her that, but it was also a blatant attempt to assert control. This is impressive, I said, closing the portfolio. But I have no intention of handing over Bellacina's future to anyone, let alone your family. Victoria's carefully composed expression faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. Alexander, this isn't about control. It's about taking advantage of the resources we can provide. Richard, who had been silent until now, chimed in. She's right. You've done an incredible job building this, but you can't ignore the benefits of having the Devereux name attached to it. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising even me. The Devereux name? You think I need your name to succeed? Bellacina is already thriving without it. What I need is autonomy, not interference. James, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. Victoria, maybe Alexander has a point. He's built this from the ground up. If he doesn't want our help, we should respect that. Victoria shot him a sharp look, but James held his ground. I glanced at him, silently appreciating his support, even if it was unexpected. I appreciate the offer, I said, turning back to Victoria and Richard. But my decision is final. Bellacina's future will be decided by me and my team, not by a family who's spent years looking down on what I do. Victoria's lips thinned, and for the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. Richard, however, leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quieter, more serious tone. Alexander, don't let pride blind you to opportunities. This isn't about pride, I replied evenly. It's about principles. Bellacina represents everything I've worked for, and I won't compromise that for anyone. The meeting ended with Victoria and Richard leaving in a huff, their frustration palpable. James stayed behind, lingering awkwardly near the door. For what it's worth, he said after a moment, I think you're making the right choice. They've always been more concerned with appearances than substance. I nodded, appreciating his honesty. Thanks, James. He hesitated before adding, and for what it's worth, Grace isn't as blind as she seems. She knows she's messed up. She just doesn't know how to fix it. I didn't respond, and after a moment, James left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That evening, I returned home to find Grace waiting for me. She was sitting on the porch steps, her face pale and tired. How was your meeting with my family? She asked softly. Predictable, I replied, stepping past her to unlock the door. She followed me inside, her gaze fixed on the floor. They told me what happened, she said after a long silence. About the expansion plans. They're upset, but I think you're right to keep control. Her admission caught me off guard, but I didn't let it show. Why this sudden change of heart? Grace shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things. About you. About us. I turned to face her, searching her eyes for sincerity. And what are you going to do about it, Grace? Words won't fix what's broken. She nodded slowly. I know, but I want to try. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. But I also knew that rebuilding trust wasn't something that could happen overnight. Then show me, I said simply. Actions, not words. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, it felt like I was in control of my own life. The Devereux family had underestimated me, but that was their mistake. Belisina was mine, and no one, not Victoria, not Richard, and not even Grace, could take that away from me. The days following the Devereux family's tense visit to Belisina were surprisingly quiet. Victoria and Richard had stopped their calls and emails, and Grace seemed to retreat into herself. I couldn't decide if the calm was a prelude to chaos or if they were genuinely rethinking their approach. Either way, I wasn't about to let my guard down. One afternoon, as I sat in the bakery reviewing our newest expansion plans, my assistant Sarah interrupted me. Alexander, there's someone here to see you, she said hesitantly. It's James. James? Of all the Devereux family members, he was the one I least expected to see. I nodded for her to let him in. James entered, looking as though he'd been battling some inner turmoil. He sat down across from me, hands clasped tightly. Alexander, I came here because I need to speak to you. Off the record. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I've always been the quiet one in the family, he began, his tone unusually candid. But I've been watching everything unfold, and I can't stay silent anymore. My parents, Grace, they've all underestimated you. They thought you were just the baker who married into the family, but they don't see what I see. And what do you see? I asked, leaning back in my chair. I see someone who's built something real, something meaningful. Belisina isn't just a business. It's a reflection of your values, your hard work. And they've been blind to it because they're so obsessed with appearances and control. I studied James carefully. He wasn't like the rest of the Devereux. He'd always been quieter, more introspective. But I couldn't ignore the fact that he was still one of them. What's your point, James? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated, then leaned forward. I want to help you. Not them, just you. I know how my family operates, and I know they're not going to stop trying to control you. But I believe in what you're doing, and I want to be part of it. His words caught me off guard. And why should I trust you? I asked. Because I'm tired of being part of the problem, he said simply. And because I think you're the only one who can teach them a lesson they'll actually remember. After a long pause, I nodded. All right, James. Let's see what you've got. Over the next few weeks, James became an unlikely ally. He helped me navigate the world of high-powered investors and corporate politics, offering insights into the Devereux family's connections and strategies. Together, we strengthened Belisina's position, ensuring that no one, not even Victoria, could undermine it. Meanwhile, Grace began to show small signs of change. She started spending more time at the bakery, quietly observing and occasionally helping out. She didn't say much, but her presence felt different, less critical, more reflective. One evening, as I locked up the bakery, Grace approached me. You've been spending a lot of time with James lately, she said, her tone cautious. He's been helpful, I replied. Why? Does that bother you? She shook her head. No, it doesn't. I'm surprised. He's never taken an interest in anything before. Maybe he sees something worth investing in, I said pointedly, meeting her gaze. Grace looked away, her expression troubled. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about actions, not words. And I want you to know that I'm trying, Alexander. I really am. Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For the first time in years, it felt like Grace was genuinely trying to bridge the gap between us. but I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely. Not yet. The turning point came a few weeks later, during a meeting with potential investors. James had arranged for me to present Bellacina's expansion plans to a group of high-profile entrepreneurs, many of whom had ties to the Devereux family. It was a risk, but one I was willing to take. As I stood before the room, detailing Bellacina's journey and future vision, I caught a glimpse of Grace sitting quietly at the back. Her eyes were fixed on me, her expression unreadable. When the presentation ended, the room erupted into applause, and several investors approached me with enthusiastic offers. Grace waited until the crowd thinned out before approaching me. "You were incredible," she said softly. "I've never seen you like that before." "This is who I've always been, Grace," I replied. "You just never took the time to see it." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in her expression. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." That night, as we walked home together, I felt a glimmer of hope. Grace wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to rebuild something real. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were walking in the same direction, rather than pulling apart. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the future might hold more than just success for Bellacina. It might hold a second chance for us, too. The weeks following Grace's quiet apology marked a shift in the dynamic between us. It wasn't a dramatic transformation overnight. Life doesn't work that way, but I could see she was making an effort. For the first time in years, we weren't locked in a constant battle of words or silence. There was peace, tentative though it was. But peace didn't mean complacency. I still had work to do, both for Bellacina and for myself. My alliance with James had proven invaluable. His knowledge of the corporate world had helped secure several major investors, and the international expansion plans were finally taking shape. The bakery remained my sanctuary, a reminder of where it all began. And Grace? Well, Grace was beginning to show up more often, both physically and emotionally. One evening, as I was closing up the bakery, Grace walked in carrying a bag. "I brought dinner," she said, her voice light, almost tentative. I raised an eyebrow but smiled. "To what do I owe the honor?" She shrugged, setting the bag down on the counter. "I figured you could use a break. You've been working nonstop." I paused, studying her. There was no edge to her tone, no underlying critique, just a simple gesture of kindness. "Thanks," I said, pulling out a chair. "Let's eat." As we sat across from each other, the conversation was easy, natural, even. She asked about the investors, the expansion plans, and my vision for Bellacina. She listened, really listened, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years. "You've built something incredible, Alexander," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine. "I don't think I ever truly appreciated that before." Her words caught me off guard, but I managed a small smile. "It hasn't been easy, but it's worth it." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I know I haven't made it easy either. I'm sorry for that." It wasn't the first time she'd apologized, but this time, it felt different. It felt real. The following week, Grace surprised me by showing up at Bellacina during a team meeting. She slipped in quietly, sitting at the back, and stayed for the entire session. When it was over, she approached me with a smile. "I was impressed," she said. "You're a natural leader." "Thanks," I replied, still unsure of her intentions. "I was thinking," she continued, "maybe I could help with the expansion. Marketing, branding, those are areas I know well." I hesitated. The old me would have jumped at the offer, eager to mend the cracks in our relationship, but the new me was cautious. I needed to be sure her intentions were genuine, not driven by guilt or obligation. "I'll think about it," I said carefully. Grace didn't seem offended by my hesitation. If anything, she seemed to respect it. "Take your time," she said. "I just want to help, if you'll let me." Over the next few months, Grace slowly integrated herself into Bellacina's operations. She started small, helping with social media campaigns and event planning. To my surprise, she was good at it. Better than good, actually. Her connections in the corporate world opened doors I hadn't even considered, and her eye for design brought a fresh perspective to the brand. But what stood out the most was her attitude. She wasn't doing this to take control or prove a point. She was doing it because she genuinely believed in Bellassina and in me. One evening, as we worked late in the office, she turned to me with a smile. You know, I used to think success was all about appearances, about having the right connections, the right image. But watching you, it's taught me that real success comes from passion and integrity. You built this with your own two hands, Alexander. That's something to be proud of. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had felt like I was fighting against her family, against the world. But now, for the first time, it felt like we were on the same side. Our personal life began to improve alongside Bellassina's growth. We started spending more time together, not just as business partners, but as a couple. We went on long walks, shared quiet dinners, and even started planning a small vacation, something we hadn't done in years. The bakery, too, became a symbol of our renewed connection. Grace often joined me in the mornings, helping with the pastries and chatting with customers. It wasn't her world, not really, but she embraced it in a way that felt genuine. One morning, as we stood side by side behind the counter, she turned to me with a smile. "I think your grandmother would be proud," she said softly. I looked at her, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "You think so?" "I know so," she replied. "She'd be proud of everything you've built and of the man you've become." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. Grace and I still had a long way to go, but for the first time, it felt like we were heading in the right direction. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope, not just for Bellassina's future, but for ours. The weeks and months that followed were nothing short of transformative. Bellassina was no longer just a dream or a small-town success story. It had become a thriving brand poised to make an international impact. Every move felt purposeful, every decision a step closer to realizing the vision I had nurtured for years. And, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was walking this path alone. Grace's involvement in the business, while initially met with hesitation on my part, had proven invaluable. Her sharp eye for branding and her connections within the corporate world had opened doors that had previously seemed out of reach. Still, I ensured that every decision was guided by the principles that had built Bellassina: quality, integrity, and a genuine love for the craft. One of the most significant milestones was the grand opening of our first international location in London. The event was a culmination of months of planning and hard work. Grace had taken charge of the marketing campaign, crafting a narrative that emphasized Bellassina's humble beginnings and its commitment to tradition. The story resonated, drawing attention from major media outlets and food critics. Standing outside the London location on the night of the opening, I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. The crowd that had gathered was larger than I had ever anticipated. Journalists, influencers, and locals lined up to get a taste of what Bellassina had to offer. As I addressed the crowd, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. "Bellassina started as a small bakery in a quiet town," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "It was built on my grandmother's recipes and the belief that food has the power to bring people together. Today, we celebrate not just the opening of a new location, but the journey that brought us here. Thank you for being a part of it." The applause that followed was deafening, but it wasn't just the crowd that caught my attention. Grace stood at the edge of the stage, her eyes glistening with pride. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly in this together. The success of the London launch set the tone for what was to come. Over the next year, Bellassina expanded into Paris and Tokyo, each location designed to reflect the local culture while staying true to the brand's roots. The team I had built, including Grace, worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. During this time, my relationship with Grace continued to evolve. The cracks that had once threatened to break us apart were now being filled with mutual respect and understanding. She had learned to appreciate the hard work and passion that went into building Bellassina, and I had learned to let her in, to trust that we could be stronger together. One evening, after a particularly long day at the Paris location, we sat together in the quiet of the dining area. The restaurant had closed for the night, and the only sounds were the faint clinking of glasses as the staff cleaned up. Grace turned to me, a tired but content smile on her face. "You've built something incredible, Alexander," she said softly, "and I'm so proud to be a part of it." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We've built something incredible," I corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her smile widened, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of peace. We weren't perfect, and our journey hadn't been easy, but we had found our way back to each other. As Bellasina continued to grow, so did the opportunities. I was approached by investors interested in franchising the brand, but I was cautious. Expansion was important, but not at the cost of losing what made Bellasina special. Grace and I spent countless nights discussing the future of the business, weighing the pros and cons of every proposal. In the end, we decided to take a measured approach, focusing on quality over quantity. It was a decision that aligned with our values and ensured that Bellasina remained a brand we could both be proud of. The bakery, my original pride and joy, remained a cornerstone of my life. Despite the success of the international locations, I made it a point to spend time there whenever I could. Grace often joined me, rolling up her sleeves and helping with the morning rush. It became a tradition of sorts, a way to stay grounded amidst the whirlwind of success. One morning, as we worked side by side, a customer approached the counter and asked for Grace's recommendation. She smiled, suggesting the almond croissant, a recipe passed down from my grandmother. Watching her interact with the customers, seeing the genuine joy on her face, I realized how much had changed. Grace was no longer the woman who had once dismissed the bakery as too small or not enough. She had grown, just as I had, and together we had created something truly remarkable. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led to this point. The betrayals, the struggles, the triumphs, they had all been part of the journey. Bellasina's success was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of staying true to one's values. But more than that, it was a reminder that even the most broken relationships could be mended with time, effort, and a willingness to change. Grace and I weren't the same people we had been when we first met, but we had found a way to grow together. As I looked out at the bustling dining room of Bellasina's Tokyo location, I felt a sense of gratitude. For the challenges, for the lessons, and for the chance to build something that mattered. Not just a business, but a life worth living. A year later, I found myself standing in the middle of Bellasina's newest location in New York City. The air was filled with the familiar aroma of fresh bread and pastries, mingling with the hum of conversation from eager patrons. This wasn't just another opening. It was the culmination of everything I had worked for, a testament to resilience, growth, and love. I looked around at the bustling crowd, taking in the sight of families, couples, and friends enjoying the space I had envisioned all those years ago. Each smiling face was a reminder of why I had started this journey in the first place. Bellasina wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, built not on wealth or status but on passion, hard work, and the belief that food had the power to connect people. Grace walked up to me, her expression a mix of pride and gratitude. She had been by my side through the entire process, helping plan every detail of the New York launch. The woman who once dismissed the bakery as too small had become my greatest advocate, and her unwavering support meant more to me than words could express. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she asked, her voice filled with awe as she scanned the room. I smiled, nodding. "It feels surreal," I admitted. "But it's not just about how far we've come. It's about everything we've learned along the way." Grace reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've built something incredible, Alexander. Something that will outlast all of us." Her words struck a chord, and I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought us here. It hadn't been easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the weight of betrayal and disappointment felt too heavy to bear. But those challenges had shaped me, had forced me to grow in ways I never imagined. After the launch event, we returned to the original bakery, the place where it had all started. It was quiet, the warm glow of the kitchen lights casting a soft glow on the familiar space. Grace and I sat at one of the small tables, sharing a slice of almond croissant and a cup of coffee, just like we used to in the early days of our relationship. "It feels good to be back here," Grace said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "This place, it's home." I nodded, my heart swelling with gratitude. No matter how much we expand, this will always be the heart of Bellasina, I said. It's a reminder of where we started and why we do what we do. Grace smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. I'm proud of you, Alexander, and I'm proud of us. We've come a long way. Her words brought a lump to my throat. There was a time when I thought our relationship was beyond repair, when the cracks seemed too deep to mend. But here we were, stronger than ever, united by a shared purpose and a renewed appreciation for one another. Over the next few months, we focused on building not just the business but our family. Grace's parents, once skeptical of my ambitions, had become some of our most ardent supporters. Victoria, in particular, had undergone a remarkable transformation. She now volunteered at the bakery on weekends, delighting customers with her newfound baking skills and sharing stories of her journey from skeptic to advocate. Richard, ever the businessman, had taken on an advisory role, helping us navigate the complexities of international expansion. His guidance proved invaluable, and I was grateful for the wisdom he brought to the table. Even Amanda, who had once dismissed me as an outsider, had found her place within the Bellasina family. She took charge of our social media campaigns, crafting narratives that celebrated our roots while highlighting our global impact. As Bellasina continued to thrive, I began to think about the future. I wanted the business to be more than just a source of income. I wanted it to be a force for good. We launched initiatives to support local farmers and partnered with charities to provide meals to underserved communities. Every decision we made was guided by the values that had built Bellasina: integrity, generosity, and a commitment to making a difference. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of our New York apartment, looking out at the city lights, Grace joined me. She slipped her arm around my waist, resting her head on my shoulder. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I said, "and how much more there is to do." Grace smiled, her warmth radiating through me. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Her words filled me with a sense of peace. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. The struggles and setbacks we had faced were no longer burdens. They were lessons that had shaped us into the people we were today.